will not be able to resolve the immediate passions that the book arouses into any true or total picture. The reader reads a work and fixates on the details, but fails to see the broader scope. But as readers, we are called to look beyond any given scene of domesticity, joy, violence, morality, sensuality, and even vulgarity to see what truth the author is attempting to reveal. It is for this reason that one must be equipped to recognize something besides the passages that they consider obscene, as O'Connor writes. And she goes on to say, that it is important that readers do this because Catholic readers are constantly being offended and scandalized by novels that they don't have the fundamental equipment to read in the first place. And often these are the works that are permeated with the Christian spirit. As I said before, the reader who fixates on the details and fails to see the broader scope does an injustice to the novel, because the total effect of a novel depends not only on its innate impact, but upon the experience, literary and otherwise, with which it is approached. And it is for this reason that O'Connor asks that the reader has read great books to approach novels. She says that it is through the best writing of the past that the reader is brought to understand the best writing of the present, and is able to deal with the more complicated demands of the best 20th century fiction. Though modern fiction might look simpler than the ages that preceded it, and the fiction that preceded it, it proves to be a multifaceted genre that deals with the realities of our own time. C.S. addresses this last point best when he writes, "Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths. All therefore need the books that will correct our own period." As the ideas and precepts grow, adapt, and decline, there is a corresponding shift in the content of literature. In an article written for the American Journal of Sociology by English literature professor Milton Albrecht, he writes, "At one time or another, literature has been thought to reflect economics, family relationships, climate and landscapes, attitudes, morals, races, social classes, political events, wars, religion, and many other more detailed aspects of environmental and social life." Authors are products of their own time, and whether conscious or unconscious, the themes and ideas of that time are woven into their work. It is impossible to remove a work from its historical context, because without that historical context, we lose something important. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment proves in part to be a response to the rise of nationalism in Russia, while Willa Cather's literary canon presents a portrait gallery of pioneers, influenced by the aesthetic movement of the early 20th century. Homer's Odyssey is steeped in ancient Greek culture, and that cultural mentality has seeped its way into the poem, and is especially valuable when interpreting particularly difficult passages. To remove the historical context from a work, from the work itself, is not only like removing the legs from a table, it is also like trying to separate wetness from water. Impossible and ultimately pointless. So we now see that an author is writing in the time that they are from, and that those themes are woven into their work, which brings us to the modern age. As a society dealing with the aftermath of the sexual revolution and a culture of fornication and sin, it seems only natural that literature take up sexuality in its varying forms. After all, our sex-saturated reality is the what is of the modern age. America specifically boasts and revels in and celebrates the slums of sexual depravity. We see that this is the what is of the present age. And as we've seen before, the author must acknowledge this what is in their work if they hope to be able to reveal truth, which means that this what is, this hypersexualized reality, ought not to be ignored. It should be incorporated. I can see a very legitimate counterargument to this being made, though. That even though this might be the what is of the modern age, that does not mean that an author should necessarily write about it, because isn't it reasonable to think that he might fall into a different vice, namely licentiousness, as well as encourage this vice in his readers by portraying something that has historically remained veiled. And it is here that we find the danger of pornography. Pornography is a prevalent evil in society. From those cheap serialized paperbacks with shirtless heroes and swooning damsels to the entire genre of erotica, pornography pervades the written word, just as prevalently as it pervades videos and images. It is such a rampant evil in society. Mark Regnerus, a PhD and professor of sociology at the University of Texas, Austin, wrote that 46% of males and 17% of females intentionally visit pornography sites within a given week of the American population. The tragic truth is that pornography is a what is of the modern culture. But does this mean that we should write pornography to combat pornography? That's like fighting sin with sin. To understand how authors can respond to pornography with explicit sexuality in their works, but that sexuality not be pornography, we must first understand what is meant by the term pornography. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines it concisely when they say, pornography consists in removing real or simulated sexual acts from the intimacy of partners in order to display them deliberately to third parties. It goes on to say that the chief sin of pornography is that these acts are being displayed to the public for the sake of base pleasure. Pornography effaces the value of the human person and diminishes the human form to something animalistic and undignified. The goal of pornography is clear, the arousal of the viewer, which means that by its very nature, pornography is obscene. There is a stark difference between the good book that focuses on truth and that is motivated by the pursuit of truth, and the book that is motivated by the external goal of the pleasure that it causes the reader. In the cases of such books, it suffices to give the bare minimum in order to advance the book to the point of sexuality, rather than write a rich story that points towards some truth. But what about books that don't do this? Books that develop theme and character that point towards some truth, yet at the same time utilize explicit sexuality. It is in this category of books that one finds books such as Walker Percy's Lancelot, which is rich in allusions to Dante, Arthurian legend in the chivalric tradition, and the crumbling legacy of the once aristocratic South. Percy himself said that this book was oriented towards dealing with the postmodern mind's incapacity to deal with sexuality. And in order to do so satisfyingly, he had to take up sexuality in an explicit manner. Yet, even though he takes it up in an explicit manner, it is never presented as something appealing. It is twisted and perverted and distinctly uncomfortable. No one reading Lancelot could claim that it was pornography for this reason, because it is not written for the sake of base pleasure, which leaves us with a category of books which are not pornographic, yet at the same time contain explicit sexuality. Authors have looked at the reality, seen the what is, and written that into their novels in a way that is not obscene. Still, I can see it argued that just because the author sees the what is and writes that into their novel, that does not mean that the reader ought to read it. After all, modern Catholic philosopher Alice von Hildebrand, quoting Dorothy Day, said that sexuality is one of those things that does not need to be known by anyone other than a doctor or a priest, by those who are schooled to bear it and trained to help in relation to it. The argument that follows from this is that most readers are not schooled to deal with the weight and gravity of such a sacred activity. Alice von Hildebrand continues on to say that for those unequipped, the danger is too great. While von Hildebrand argues correctly that sexuality can be dangerous, it is important to remember that nothing is risk-free. The human condition is fraught with temptations. It is the human response to these temptations that is key. Just because something contains temptation does not necessarily mean that it as a whole is impure. Dietrich von Hildebrand reflects, in every department of art, There are genuine works of art that possess genuine beauty, but which are at the same time sexually stimulating. This does not necessarily condemn them as impure. The reason for this is that the things which readers might find sexually stimulating are not done for the sake of being sexually stimulating. Rather, they are there to point towards some truth, to unveil the what is, to discover a dimension of existence. So where have we been so far, and where does that leave us? We have seen that the author must write about the what is, if they hope to be virtuous. And we must see that the reader must be prepared, and must to see the total effect of the novel. As such, we can conclude that explicit sexuality is acceptable in a novel when it falls into the virtue of correct vision, and is consumed by a reader prepared to see the total effect, and prepared to draw truth from the text. Because the sexuality is not included for the sake of base pleasure, but rather to point toward some truth. Still, some of you might have come to my oration hoping for a bit more of a practical treatment of the erotica literature. Like, what does this mean for us engaging with the modern literary canon? How do we pick books that we ought to read? The first step in picking a book that you should read in the modern literary canon is to examine oneself. Has one been adequately prepared to see the total effect of the novel, to experience the what is? This is something that requires careful reflection, because it is often the completely ignorant man who assumes that he is completely competent. Hence, the careful reflection and consideration of if you are prepared to engage with this work. Once one has spent that time in reflection and determined they are in fact prepared to engage with one of these works, the next step is to find something that is good art. Good art in a novel includes but is not limited to, does the novel have good prose? Does the author show a sufficient mastery of the technical devices and tropes necessary in a novel? Does the novel develop good characters that are pointing toward some truth? These are not considerations that are unique to sexuality in fiction. Anytime we pick up a book, we ought to be asking these two questions. Are we prepared to read this book? And is this book good art? If the answer to both of these questions are yes, then you can pick up the book and embark into it, knowing that it cannot be a risk-free experience. No book demands to be read. Perhaps one might not read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because they find Raskolnikov's rationalization of murder detestable, and Svidrigaïlov's suicide disturbing. Or one might dismiss Milton's Paradise Lost, because it appeared on the Catholic Church's banned book list for a number of years. There are a plethora of reasons to set aside good books in favor of sentimental or supposedly safe literature. Yet the man who does this loses something essential. The man who plays prudishness with prudence fails to see the what is, and instead shields himself with platitudes and forgettable novels that will not truly touch his soul. There is no clean line between a good book or a dirty book, or a safe book or an unsafe book. A good book can be a dirty book. This statement does not provide leeway for anyone at any time to seek sexual gratification out of a book. Nor does it dismiss the reality that there are dirty books that are not good books. However, what it does say is that there are good books that are dirty books. These are books that ought to be read, that speak about the what is of the modern age. But before they can be read, modernity must reclaim the reality of sexuality in fiction. It ought not be included to arouse the viewer. Rather, it ought to stir the soul and spur the reader to question what these particular passages mean. What truth is the author attempting to reveal? At the end of the day, sexuality in fiction ought to show the reality about the dangers of the present age, about mankind, and chiefly about truth. Thank you.
question that I think fairly leaps out at one particular oration. That is, you had said that sexuality ought to be incorporated into the modern novel. Does this mean that any modern novelist who fails to put explicit sexual content into his book is just, O'Connor will rise from the grave? For example, is, well, there goes Milton forgetting this, he should have known that the TV series is going to be closer than Tolkien. What would you say about that?
I think that I would say that we can look at Milton Kundera for an answer for that. He has a quote in one of his essays about how, and I think I quoted this in my oration, that the modern novelist discovers the various dimensions of existence one by one. So I wasn't saying that the only what is of the modern age is our hypersexualized culture. There are other things that the novelist could comment on, other dimensions of existence that we have in modernity. For example, the novelist could comment on the destruction of the family unit as a central nucleus in society, or something about gender roles and how those are developing, or they could write about any number of things. What I was saying was that one of the major what is of our society is this, and it ought to be included in certain fiction if that is what the author chooses to pursue as the what is and the dimension that he is particularly looking at.
Thanks, Andy. That's great. So obviously we follow up when you're saying that the kind of mindset that says there should never be sex literature is mistaken if we accept the arguments here. Is there any category of activity that is obscene, just shouldn't be there no matter what? Or would these same kinds of prudential arguments apply to every kind of?
Are you speaking to something such as violence?
Or I don't know what exactly, but could there be something like that? Something that should just never be portrayed in fiction?
That's a good question. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I'm sure we can come up with something specific, but I can't think of something off the top of my head that could never, ever, ever be included in fiction. So long as when something that is like sexuality is included in fiction, something in that vein, it is done in such a way that it is looking at the what is and is not done in an obscene manner.
If it has in some way, it has to do with the human condition. Okay, I mean, I think that's reasonable, and then I think the project of trying to think of an example might be a non-solitary exercise. What about other media? You spoke mostly about literature, but would the same things apply to film? This is a little bit self-serving because I'm on Joe Alvarez's panel this afternoon.
I think that because the written word and the not the video word, that's not what I'm reading. The written word and film are such vastly different mediums, and they have different effects on the brain, that those are two very different questions. I think that Joe would be far better to handle that question.
Well, I would like to ask you just a little bit about it, if you don't mind.
I'll take a shot at it.
Well, let's see. Have you seen the film Lives of Others?
I have not.
Well, anyways, let me take this story. Your quotation 14 on pornography from the Catholic Church. When after you read it, you added for the sake of base pleasure. Is that in the text, or did you add that?
I believe it's in the text. It's further down. It's a very long definition. It actually, and it goes on in the middle to talk about like various, such as the evil of pornography, specifically what I talk about, how it effaces the value of the human person, and then it concludes by pointing towards base pleasure being the chief sin, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Okay, that seems helpful because this by itself would seem to automatically cover any display of sexuality. So that would, okay, that's helpful. Because if we add that, then it seems like, yeah, similar considerations might apply to portrayal of sexuality in film or something like that. Even though, of course, as you suggest, the effect on the view is quite different. So, what about intermediary visual arts that aren't so realistic or graphic as film? There's a long history, for example, of famous paintings being Bowdlerized, like the Sistine Chapel, or against altarpiece because of portrayal of nakedness. Or is that a erroneous mindset that doesn't see what you're getting here, that wants to do that?
I think it would all, I'm going to take a little bit of a shot in the dark here and just apply some of the principles from my thesis and my oration. I think that if we're thinking about portraiture or sculpture, there's the whole debate about the Aphrodite of, I'm going to call the pronunciation of this, Midos, about whether that's okay or not. I think that chiefly if we're looking at it from the perspective of, is it done for the sake of base pleasure, or is it done to portray something in the what is, that is the distinction that would be helpful in regards to visual arts that aren't as realistic, such as the Sistine Chapel. And I think if we're thinking specifically about the Sistine Chapel, we can be relatively assured that it was not done for the sake of base pleasure of the viewer, since it is a chapel.
Okay, so that was just sort of an erroneous mindset, a false belief that you shouldn't paint naked people or something like that.
From the principles that I've looked at in my thesis, I would be inclined to say yes, but I did not spend as much time looking specifically at the visual arts, so I would be prepared to learn more about that to speak more accurately on that.
That's reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Some talk. You mentioned sort of midway through your talk this idea that not all books are for all people. This is like a really crucial principle as far as your argument is concerned. There are going to be cases where a person is simply not prepared for this presentation because of lack of maturity. Right? You have these quotes from Flannery O'Connor talking about 8th graders, it seems, right? Eighth graders shouldn't read a lot of this modern fiction, right? They shouldn't read Walker Percy, for example. I was wondering, so it's clear, in other words, that there's a kind of minimum level of maturity that's required to be able to approach even good literature that has sexually explicit content. Is there a point, my question is there a point of maturity or spiritual development or what have you, at which this kind of literature is no longer helpful? For example, or is it simply that there's, right, once you've reached a certain level of maturity, then it's a good thing for you to read it? I guess my question, to put it another way, would be, is it that the more mature you are, the more sexually explicit literature you should read? In other words, that, right, cloistered nuns should be the ones reading the most.
So you're asking, essentially, as you get more mature, should you read increasingly explicit literature? Or are you asking if there's a maximum cap for when this is no longer helpful?
Yeah, I could certainly see a category of people who are, right, themselves sort of immersed in a world, right, in our modern world, where it seems like reading this kind of literature helps you to make sense of the world that you're living in and to see the problem of sin, and even in your own life or in the people around you to come to some better understanding of it. I'm wondering, is there a point of, say, maturity or spiritual development at which that's no longer helpful?
Yeah, okay. I think I can speak a little bit to that. I think that I would start by asking a counter question. Is there a point where something from the tradition no longer becomes helpful? Such as, is there a point when Dante no longer becomes helpful? Dante does deal with a lot of realities of his own time. There's the whole part at the end of, I believe, the Purgatorio. Lots of weird visions. You don't quite know what's happening, but once you start reading it as being politically charged and pointing to certain political events, then it starts to make more sense. But there are still themes that are timeless and important to us even now. And so I'd say that arguably some of these books, such as Walker Percy, have a right to be read in, say, 100 years, and looked at in 100 years, because they are still looking at the what is and are saying something valuable about that what is. We shouldn't stop reading great books after their time. And so I would say that I don't think that there would be a maximum cap of maturity. If that does that address your question?
That's helpful, yeah.
Great, I don't think to the audience now.
Dr. Virginia, your hand is up first.
Well, you've really found your voice, Andy. Thank you for a very graceful presentation. You keep saying if you know art, then you'll be able to determine whether something is inappropriately explicit in matters of sexuality or not in a novel. And but I wondered, out of your native modesty, if you on purpose avoided examples that might give us an indication of your good critical sense. And so, if, for instance, if you took the whales in Moby Dick in their leviathanic amours, you wouldn't have any scruples, I suppose, reading it. But if you read the scene where Ike McCaslin's wife is seducing him so that he will take his inheritance, it's a very different experience. Right.
Absolutely.
So how do you determine the appropriateness of that latter example? And or maybe you could give us some other ones with which we're familiar or with which you're familiar, because
Actually, just as a general principle, we see that the scene in Faulkner, it would be a lot less palatable to us if it wasn't in Faulkner. For example, if it was just placed in a book where we didn't have all of the contextualization and we're just given sort of this light, fluffy book that leads, and all of a sudden there's a scene where a husband is, or a wife is trying to seduce her husband. We would have a larger problem with that. But because we have Faulkner and because we can see the total effect of the work, and we've seen throughout what is going on between Ike and the land and his perspective on it, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but prior to that conversation with his wife, he's already had the conversation with McCaslin Edmund. So he's already had that conversation about the land and what that means and how he doesn't believe that people can own that. And so we have sort of the context of what Faulkner is trying to do with that, and we start to see the total effect of that. Versus
so you call that total effect the form of the work? The form, is that what you mean by the truth of a work, the form of it, when all the parts fit?
I think that would have something to do with that. That would definitely have an element in the total effect, and the novel taken as a whole, not just a singular part of it. Is that?
And yet it could be very titillating reading that scene.
If you didn't have everything else that points to you, and also why it's wrong, why the wife is not doing what she ought to be doing in that situation. Well, maybe I'm sure that we could have a long debate as to whether or not the wife is justified.
Thank you.
Are the only legitimate incorporations of explicit sexuality in literature for the sake of pointing out sin and disorders of sexuality, or are there ever legitimate incorporations of explicit sexuality to show something good about sex?
I wrestled with this question. I think primarily in the literature that I read, it was primarily pointing out some sin or some disorder in most of what I read for this thesis. I could see a situation such as Milton's Paradise Lost, which has the scene in book 6, maybe, of when they...
It's earlier.
Is it earlier?
6 is the war in heaven.
Oh, right, 6.
I hope it's not.
Okay. Somewhere between book 1 and book 6, there's a scene wherein Adam and Eve retreat to a blissful bower, and that's portrayed as something good and something positive. So I think that there could be a place for that in literature. That just was not the examples that I read, particularly pursuing this project. Does that help answer your question?
I mean, I'd like, maybe like Dr. Virginia, I'd like you to do a little bit more application. Maybe this goes to a question about what it is about the modern novel and the modern period and your kind of historicization of all these questions. But to make it a little bit more practical for the people in the room, Lysistrata. Do you read Lysistrata as simply as obscene, presumably not a sentimental. Having correct vision in pointing out the depravities of Athenian sexuality, or as having correct vision but pointing out and celebrating something good about human sexuality.
In the particular example of Lysistrata, I think it is in some ways, it's been a long time since I've reviewed and read through Lysistrata, but I believe it is more oriented to pointing out sort of this disorder. We have a disorder that ends in a resolution of order, where things have been restored to their natural order. So I think it is pointing out something in a more disordered fashion. That would be my initial inclination, but it's been a long time since I've read through Lysistrata.
Final short question. Who is it who is supposed to be, is it always the individual who's supposed to be discerning whether they're prepared or not? Or should students in the room, by virtue of being admitted to the college, simply trust that their professors trust that they are prepared to read everything that is assigned?
I think that because we ought to always be asking the two questions of, is it good art and am I prepared, that in some ways there is always a duty on the student or on the person and the individual to determine whether or not they are prepared. But that being said, I don't want to be giving an excuse to anybody to not do their readings because I don't think that they're prepared. But if anything is in the tradition, I think that we can safely say that something that appears in the tradition and is included in the curriculum is something that fits within the virtue of correct vision.
Right, there's also the reader side of it, not just the author, right? Whether the reader's prepared or not.
And we start with books that maybe require less preparation to get some meaning out of them. We start a little bit, not a bit shallow, not the field is shallow, I don't want to say that. But we start and we build up to a lot more complicated books. We don't just go straight out the gate with Madame Bovary. And like, all right, here's an adulteress. So, or with Brothers K. So we build up to that, and we build that reader preparation. I think specifically this
So students should be docile or should not be docile?
That question makes me think of another famously sweaty piece of literature that has sometimes been criticized on similar grounds, namely the Song of Songs.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Callaway. So pretty early on in the oration, you said something to the effect that we should set aside our preconceptions when approaching a novel. Does this apply when we're reading something philosophical that perhaps we think we will disagree with? For example, approaching Machiavelli or Karl Marx.
I think that is specifically, this is a little outside the topic of what I was pursuing, but specifically when it comes to something philosophical, it is important to at least be open to understanding their arguments, right? Because they don't just believe something for the sake of believing it. They have built from premises an argument. What we did in politics last semester was we looked at some of the modern philosophers, modern political philosophers, and sort of engaged with their arguments and why they believe what they believed. And we also compared it to Aristotle, but there was a level at which you had to treat the philosophers as that is the argument that they are making. And you have to be willing to see that argument versus just writing it off like, oh, I know I'm not going to agree with Hobbes' perspective on what happiness is. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
So you talked a lot about how when the author is writing something explicit, it's oftentimes combating something in society, and that the disposition of the reader needs to be a certain way. But how can the author in good conscience write sexually explicit works when the society is so apt to take them just for base pleasures?
I think that there's a couple important